On July 19, 1975, a sad chapter was written in the political history of Sierra Leone when 8 of 15 men who were tried and convicted for an alleged coup attempt of July 1974 were executed at the Pademba Road Prison in Freetown, Sierra Leone. On the morning of the executions, the bodies of the men who had been killed by hanging were displayed for about an hour before the crowd outside the Pademba Road Prison in Freetown, in order to send a strong message to all those who might want to attempt to overthrow the government. The sad display of the bodies of the men who had been killed by hanging sent shockwaves throughout Sierra Leone and even beyond. The marathon trial and eventual executions of these men was not only a burden of grief to family and loved ones, but a terrible loss to the entire nation. In this episode, we cover one of the darkest moments in Sierra Leone's history. However, to fully understand the root cause of this alleged coup attempt, now believed to have been stage managed, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. Sierra Leone was under British occupation for approximately 153 years, from 1808 to 1961. The Crown Colony, which included Freetown and its surrounding areas, was established in 1808, and in 1896 the hinterland of Sierra Leone became a British protectorate, thus creating Sierra Leone Protectorate, now known as the provinces. Altogether, the country gained its independence from Britain and became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations on April 27, 1961, with Sir Milton Margai of the Sierra Leone People's Party, the SLPP, as its first Prime Minister, and upon his death in 1964, he was succeeded as Prime Minister and head of the governing SLPP by his younger brother, Sir Albert Margai, as the country's second Prime Minister. Sierra Leone held its second general elections as an independent nation in March 1967, with the first being held in 1962. The 1967 Sierra Leonean general election was the first successful democratic election held in post-colonial Africa. Opposition leader Siaka Stevens of the All People's Congress Party, the APC, which was founded in 1960 as a breakaway from the SLPP party, won the election, marking the first time that a ruling party had lost an election in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding white-ruled South Africa and southern Rhodesia. However, within hours of taking office, Siaka Stevens was ousted in a military coup led by the army commander, Brigadier General David Lansana, a close ally of Sir Albert Margai, who had appointed him to the position in 1964. Siaka Stevens and the Governor-General were placed under arrest by the then ADC to the Governor-General, Lieutenant Samuel Hinga Norman, who was acting on the orders of the force commander on what Siaka Stevens claimed were the orders of Sir Albert Margai. Brigadier General David Lansana took power and declared martial law. 2 days later, on March 23, 1967, Brigadier General David Lansana was himself overthrown in a counter-military coup by a group of majors, namely Major Augustine Charles Blake, Major Sandy Bokari Jumu, and Major Bokari Idrissa Kai Samba. Sir Albert Margai and Brigadier General David Lansana were both arrested and detained. The political loyalties of all three officers lay with the SLPP camp, but not with Sir Albert Margai. Major Kai Samba's brother, Kutubu Kai Samba, was not only a thorn in Albert Margai's political flesh. His defection from the SLPP actually cost Albert Margai the 1967 elections. The two coups of 1967 were nonetheless similar in that they represented the continuation of civilian party politics by other means. The trio who removed Brigadier General David Lansana from office were certainly not Albert Margai loyalists, but they were even less sympathetic to the prospect of an All-People's Congress APC government, the party that won the 1967 elections. Thus, rather than return the country to constitutional rule, the trio of coup leaders decided to form a junta, the National Reformation Council, NRC, which ruled the country for a year. Initially, the NRC announced that its leader would be Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda, who at the time was the country's second secretary at the United Nations in New York. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was posted abroad in 1966 after the force commander, Brigadier General David Lansana, accused him of acts of insubordination. He was cashiered from the army and given an administrative post in the Ministry of External Affairs and later sent on a diplomatic assignment in the Sierra Leone mission to the United Nations. 4 days after the announcement, there was a sudden change in leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Gender was replaced as leader of the NRC by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Jackson Smith, who, at the time of his appointment, was on an officer's course in Britain. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Jackson Smith thus returned home and took over the leadership of the NRC. The NRC dissolved political parties and suspended the constitution. After 13 months of military rule, the APC was restored to power following a counter-military coup with its leader Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister in April 1968. At the same time, the Constitution of Sierra Leone was restored, with Siaka Stevens being asked to form a national government by appointing both APC and SLPP members into the cabinet. As soon as Siaka Stevens assumed the premiership, he soon embarked on consolidating his rule. The national government that was formed, which was to incorporate members of the SLPP, favored the APC more than the formula that Siaka Stevens had agreed to with the new SLPP leader, Saliha Jusu Sheriff, whose party was given fewer ministries than it had anticipated. Soon, election petitions were taken out against successful SLPP candidates in the previous general election. Within a month of the establishment of the national government, 27 petitions had been filed by defeated APC candidates, including 2 against former Prime Minister Albert Margai, who had fled the country, and Saliha Jusu Sheriff, the SLPP parliamentary leader and Minister of Health in the national government. By the end of July 1968, 20 SLPP seats were declared vacant by the courts, and a very violent by-elections were conducted, which resulted in many casualties. As a result of the violence, some by-elections in the south and eastern parts of the country were postponed. Calm was not completely restored, and in November 1968, Siaka Stevens declared a state of emergency after disturbances in the provinces. Siaka Stevens pursued a vigorous policy of consolidating his political hold on the country. The national government, which was formed on return to civilian rule and included SLPP members, soon ran into problems. One APC backbencher, Ibrahim Bashtaki, a journalist who had contributed so much to Siaka Stevens' election victory, criticized the idea of a joint APC and SLPP government, pointing out that the APC had fought tyranny for 5 years and the people had given their verdict. He wanted to know why the defeated party should be admitted into the government. As a result, the national government was dissolved in 1969, and Ibrahim Bashtaki was appointed Minister of Information and Broadcasting in 1969. More pressing, however, was the need for Siaka Stevens to strengthening his ties with, and in fact his control of the military. Less than 2 months after his return, Siaka Stevens purged the army of several officers, all Mendi, who were subsequently arrested for allegedly intriguing with unnamed SLPP politicians. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Gender, a Mende who was then the second highest ranking officer, was forced to retire. The principal actors in the successive coups of 1967, Brigadier David Lansana, Major Charles Blake, Police Commissioner William Leake, Major Bokari Idrissa Kai Samba, Lieutenant Samuel Norman, and 5 civilian collaborators were tried for treason and sentenced to be hanged. The NRC chairman, Andrew Jackson Smith, was tried separately since he did not actually participate in either of the 2 coups, but was likewise sentenced to death. Although the Sierra Leone Court of Appeal eventually ruled that the charges had been improperly drawn up and declared the proceedings null, Siaka Stevens continued to detain David Lansana, Andrew Jackson Smith, and the others into the 1970s. Not content with purging senior-level threats, Siaka Stevens also borrowed a page from former Prime Minister Albert Margai's playbook for controlling the military by forming an officer corps loyal to his regime and prepared to defend it against internal opposition. Upon entering office, Siaka Stevens immediately implemented a 15% increase in the pay for all warrant officers, NCOs, and privates, whose ranks constituted the backbone of the mutiny that paved the way for his return to power, and promised increased military expenditures for new weapons as well as improved living conditions. In June 1969, Siaka Stevens set up a 28-member committee representing various areas and groups in the country except the SLPP and the Chamber of Commerce, to advise on the sort of Republican constitution to be adopted. In addressing this committee, Siaka Stevens pointed out that the monarchical constitution, which Sierra Leone adopted from independence, had outlived its usefulness. And that, besides, that constitution tended to foster political links with the old colonial power and thus prevented Sierra Leone assuming a role as a fully independent sovereign state. Opposition groups were concerned that Siaka Stevens was aiming for an executive type of presidency which would make him unaccountable to the cabinet. The Minister of Information and Broadcasting, Ibrahim Bashtaki, voiced out his dislike for the establishment of a republican system of government. Consequently, Ibrahim Bashtaki fell out with Siaka Stevens. The following year, Siaka Stevens reshuffled the cabinet and Ibrahim Bashtaki was on the backbenches once more, as he was relieved of his ministerial portfolio. But as a member of parliament, representing his Freetown East constituency, Ibrahim Bashtaki was eloquently outspoken. He religiously continued his campaign against Siaka Stevens' plan to go on with the Republican Constitution, and this led to him being labeled an enemy of the state by Siaka Stevens. Specially assigned detectives trailed him around the country. His Brisker four-wheel van became the constant victim of harassment at checkpoints whenever he traveled up country. The steady consolidation of power by Siaka Stevens and his government did not go unopposed for long. In December 1969, a group of university graduates returning to Sierra Leone from abroad together with graduates from Fura Bay College, the oldest Western-style university institution in sub-Saharan Africa, who felt that the APC's policy of encouraging members of the Creole ethnic group to monopolize top positions in the civil service and the professions was a betrayal of the upcountry people who were the party's strongest supporters. They formed the Sierra Leone Provincial Organization, SLPO, an ostensibly non-partisan group whose manifesto declared its primary objective to promote and maintain a strong national consciousness and a sense of oneness, thereby encouraging unity and understanding among the provincials. The Young Radicals preached a reform of the system, and before long the organization was absorbed in May 1970 by a new political organization known as the National Democratic Party, NDP, led by Hamid Taki, a younger brother of Siaka Stevens' Minister of Development, Mohamed Bashtaki. The NDP rallied support with the charge that Siaka Stevens was planning to transform Sierra Leone from a parliamentary democracy into a centralized republic with an autocratic presidency along the lines pursued by Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. The formation of the NDP may not have been unconnected with moves by a younger group of APC members who wished to effect changes in the party's constitution by the appointment of a deputy to Siaka Stevens in the party hierarchy. It was charged that there was an imbalance in the party structure which favored Siaka Stevens and the APC Secretary General, Christian Alusine Kamara Taylor, popularly known as C.A. Kamara Taylor, Siaka Stevens' Minister of Finance Dr. Mohamed Sore Forna, and Ibrahim Taki, who served briefly as Minister of Information and Broadcasting after the dissolution of the national government in 1969, were believed to be interested in the deputy leadership. They were rebuffed when an APC convention in May 1970 refused to consider the question of a party deputy to Prime Minister Siaka Stevens. Tensions heightened with the return to Freetown in July 1970 of Dr. John Karefa Smart, who had served as Sierra Leone's first Foreign Affairs Minister under the country's first Prime Minister Sir Milton Margai, and resigned in protest against Sir Albert Margai's appointment as Prime Minister in 1964, to join the APC a year later. He served with the World Health Organization as an Assistant Director General until his return to Sierra Leone. It was believed that he too wanted a top post in the party hierarchy or in the government, probably the Governor Generalship. Despite his distinguished service from 1965 to 1970 as the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization (WHO) in Switzerland, the returned Karefa Smart was offered only the ambiguous position of advisor by Siaka Stevens, who regarded him warily as a potential rival for the leadership of the APC. Heavily sidelined by the regime, John Karefa Smart became the focus of dissidents within the APC, including Ibrahim Bashtaki and Finance Minister Mohamed Sore Forna, both of whom hailed from the same Tonkolili district in the northern province of the country, as did John Karefa Smart. The strained relationship between Siaka Stevens and some of his ministers surfaced in September 1970, when Finance Minister Mohamed Sore Forna and the Minister of Development Mohamed Bashtaki, both of them also representing different constituencies in the Tonkolili district, resigned their cabinet appointments while Siaka Stevens was attending the non-aligned summit in Lusaka, Zambia. While Mohamed Bashtaki's letters were short and gave little away, Mohamed Sore Forna spelled out exactly why he would no longer serve Siaka Stevens. In his letter of resignation published in the Unity newspaper of September 12, 1970, Mohamed Sore Forna referred to his differences as Minister of Finance with Siaka Stevens' policy. He charged that in spite of advice to the contrary, Sierra Stevens had signed a contract worth 700,000 Leon for the purchase of armored cars. The military, he complained, were not given an opportunity to say yes or no to this scheme. Furthermore, he went on, consideration was being given to the purchase of an elaborate and expensive scheme for police and army communication equipment, which would cost 2,800,000 Leon. The armored cars, he pointed out, would be manned by specially selected troops primarily loyal to Sierra Stevens. All in all, Mohamed Sorry-Forna's view was that Sierra Stevens was pursuing an expensive defense policy. The letter went on to detail their disagreements over the use and misuse of government funds and how the country's reserves were at risk from Sierra Stevens' lavish spending. He accused Sierra Stevens of being behind the wave of diamond smuggling that was happening in the eastern part of the country. He laid the blame for the violence that had swept the country from 1968 to 1970 at Sierra Stevens' feet. All in all, his resignation letter shows a deeply troubled man, very worried over three major trends exhibited by Sierra Stevens: the insatiable greed for power, the introduction of violence into politics, and the misuse of public funds. Many APC supporters, however, felt these charges were exaggerated and that Mohamed Sorry-Forna was piqued because Sierra Stevens had this time deviated from his usual practice of appointing Mohamed Sorry-Forna to act as Prime Minister in his absence. Instead, he had appointed SB Kawusu Conte, a less senior minister. Added to this was the fact that Kawusu Conte was also assigned the acting portfolio of defense, which was never assigned to Mohamed Sorry-Forna while he acted. On his return from Zambia, Sierra Stevens took drastic steps against the dissidents. Mohamed Sorry-Forna and the Taki brothers, both Ibrahim Bashtaki and Mohamed Bashtaki, were expelled from the party, as were two stalwart members of the party from the Tonkolili district, Ibrahim Ortole and Abu Lako. The government put a ban on public meetings, but this was defied by opposition elements when John Karefa Smart, Sarif Ismon, a former APC supporter turned government critic, and others, organized one under the auspices of a committee of citizens in Freetown. The meeting was interrupted frequently when stones were hurled at the gathering, allegedly by APC supporters, injuring 6 people. It was reported that some of those who attended the meeting were armed. On September 14, 1970, Sierra Stevens declared a state of emergency throughout the country. In his broadcast message on the national radio, he stated that a small group of people who want to get into power by every possible means or who have lost positions of authority are doing their utmost to disrupt the peace and good government of the country. The government's threats notwithstanding, on September 20, 1970, Mohamed Sorry-Forna, Ibrahim Bashtaki, Mohamed Bashtaki and John Karefa Smart announced the formation of a new political party called the United Democratic Party, UDP, which incorporated Hamid Taki's NDP. John Karefa Smart was appointed provisional chairman. In the following weeks, the UDP held meetings in Freetown and in towns in the northern province, threatening the APC in its heartland. However, these meetings were marked by violent clashes between rival UDP and APC supporters, resulting in several people being injured and the death of one APC youth leader. The UDP was most trenchant in its criticism of the APC's bid to transform Sierra Leone into a republic. On its formation, in September 1970, the UDP promised, in a press release, to make the people of Sierra Leone aware of the threat to their individual rights and to their freedom posed by the lust of the present leaders of the APC for unbridled power. On October 8, 1970, Sierra Stevens announced the banning of the new party. The detention of the UDP leaders followed, and the army and police were used to carry out the arrests. In all, 30 of the UDP leadership members were arrested and detained. Documents belonging to the proscribed party were seized, and troops took up positions at the party's offices in Freetown. Most of the detained UDP leaders were released by early 1971 and eventually went into exile, including John Karefa Smart, who embarked on a distinguished teaching career at Harvard University School of Public Health and its medical school, until he returned to Sierra Leone to run as a presidential candidate in the 1996 Sierra Leonean general election. However, Mohamed Sorry-Forna and Ibrahim Bashtaki remained in detention. Soon after the ban on the UDP, it was revealed that a coup had been nipped in the bud. In fact, it was stated that knowledge of the attempted coup had instigated the banning of the UDP. The upshot of the coup manqué was the deportation of an American diplomat, Mark T. Colby, who was believed to be a CIA agent. A document issued by the Directorate of the Democratic Civil Resistance Movement, which was an underground body claiming to speak for the banned party, called upon UDP and SLPP supporters to rise up against tyranny and appealed to the military to aid this effort by arresting Siaka Stevens. Because most of the UDP leaders were from the Temne ethnic group that are predominantly found in the northern province of the country, it was feared that the partly Temne force commander, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, might be sympathetic with the UDP, hence his security details were infiltrated by planting spies on him. The government then dismissed 2 of his most reliable officers who were also Temne by tribe, and, on October 13th, arrested 12 warrant officers and non-commissioned officers, most of whom were also Temin soldiers believed to be sympathetic to the UDP cause, on charges of mutiny. While wary of confronting Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura directly, however, Siaka Stevens did not move against him immediately. Instead, Siaka Stevens turned to Guinean leader Sékou Touré for assistance in shoring up his control over the Sierra Leonean military. In mid-March 1971, Siaka Stevens visited Conakry, Guinea, and discussed a mutual assistance pact that, while ostensibly aimed at defending against external aggression, was clearly also an internal defense. Immediately after the visit, a number of Guinean soldiers in civilian dress were introduced into Freetown. As Siaka Stevens perhaps anticipated, the force commander Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura reacted to the provocation. On March 23, 1971, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura staged a coup. However, he had little support within the army and the coup quickly collapsed. He, along with others, were brought to trial on charges of mutiny and incitement to mutiny by violence. The force commander Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, along with 3 others, were sentenced to death and executed. I have already made a video on Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura's failed coup. You can check it out on this channel. In the wake of the coup attempt, on March 28th, Siaka Stevens announced the formal signing of the Mutual Defense Pact with Guinea. The next day, Guinean soldiers were airlifted in Freetown to take up defensive positions around Siaka Stevens' residence and other significant edifices. Following the execution of the force commander Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, Siaka Stevens appointed Colonel Joseph Saidou Momo, who was John Amadou Bangura's deputy, as force commander. The APC continued calling for the establishment of a republic, citing the crisis situation during the abortive coup of John Amadou Bangura as indicative of the need to unite the positions of head of state and head of government to be united in the same person. Siaka Stevens then introduced into Parliament a bill enabling him to proclaim Sierra Leone a republic without the assent of the Governor-General. The measure passed on April 15, 1971. 4 days later, despite the flagrant violation of the Sierra Leonean Constitution of 1961, which provided that a new constitution shall not become law unless it has been passed by the House of Representatives in 2 successive parliaments, there having been a dissolution between the first and the second of those parliaments, and unless the final vote thereon in each such parliament it is supported by the votes of not less than 2/3 of the members of the House, the government then pushed through, on April 19th, an act creating the Republic of Sierra Leone with the Chief Justice Christopher Okoro Cole as ceremonial president. 2 days later, on April 21st, Siaka Stevens was installed as the first executive president of the nation with wide executive and legislative powers. Sore Ibrahim Koroma, popularly known as S.I. Koroma, who had served successively as Minister of Trade and Industry from 1968 to 1969 and Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources from 1969 to 1971, became Vice President and Prime Minister of the new Republic. The new Republican Constitution exalted the presidential office by stating that there shall be a supreme head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, who shall be known as the President of Sierra Leone. He shall embody the national unity and ensure the continuance of the state. As guardian of the Constitution, he shall be the guarantor of national independence, of the integrity of the territory, of respect for treaties and international agreements. He shall be the fountainhead of justice and the fountain of honor. Furthermore, the Constitution essentially put the incumbent head of state above the law, stipulating that, whilst any person holds or performs the functions of the office of president, no civil or criminal proceedings shall be instituted or continued against him in respect to anything done or omitted to be done by him, either in his official capacity or in his private capacity. As soon as Siaka Stevens became president, he ordered the release of some of the players of the successive coups of 1967. However, former Army Commander David Lansana and former junta leader Andrew Jackson Smith, who had won their appeals against the death sentence, remained in detention together with Mohamed Sorieforna and Ibrahim Bashtaki. Upon assuming the presidency, Siaka Stevens also had the APC-dominated parliament abolish the right of appeal for court-martial defendants, making the verdict of a court-martial final and not open to challenge in any court. In spite of some semblance of political stability, Siaka Stevens preferred not to leave security matters solely in the hands of the army and police. Having once advocated the establishment of a people's militia, he now successfully negotiated with the Cuban government to train a paramilitary body which later became known as the Internal Security Unit, ISU, and was attached to the police force. With the turbulence of the 1967 election in mind, Siaka Stevens took the opportunity to remind the army of its role as a national body. In January 1973, he announced that a general election would be conducted that year and expressed the hope that the army would consider it a duty to help maintain law and order and secure the interest of the nation rather than the individual. As the election campaign proceeded, in March 1973, Parliament passed the Public Order Act, which empowered the president to declare a state of public emergency when a situation warranted it. Consequently, an immediate declaration of a nationwide state of emergency was announced by Siaka Stevens when the House was dissolved on April 18, 1973. Clashes between supporters of the APC and the SLPP occurred in Freetown and in the provincial towns of Bo and Kanema, resulting in 10 deaths during nomination day on April 24, 1973. Consequently, the exercise was postponed in 4 constituencies in Freetown and 8 in the town of Kanema in the eastern province of the country. By the time the elections were due, it was declared that the SLPP had withdrawn its candidates for the contest since the APC had already contrived to get a majority largely by unopposed candidates. The APC subsequently secured 84 out of 85 seats, the latter being won by an independent candidate who later declared his support for the APC. This election was largely a farce, and for the next 5 years, there was no opposition in parliament, although the country was not officially a one-party state. Following the return to power of the APC, Siaka Stevens visited the Wilberforce Barracks in Freetown in May 1973 and thanked the force commander and his men for the valuable service which they had given during the general election. Towards the end of the month, Colonel Joseph Saidu Momo, the force commander, was promoted to the rank of brigadier, while the deputy force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sam King, and the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sheku Tarawali, were promoted to full colonels. Their promotions were backdated to the first day of 1973. Other incentives to the security forces included an extra month's salary for the army and the police. With Siaka Stevens firmly in power, the release of detained ex-officers and political rivals was ordered. In July 1973, David Lansana, Andrew Jackson Smith, Ibrahim Bashtaki, Mohamed Sorieforna and others regained their freedom. In July 1974, President Siaka Stevens traveled out of the country on a visit to Europe, leaving Vice President and Prime Minister S.I. Koroma to act as President and Finance Minister C.A. Kamara Taylor to act as Vice President and Prime Minister. While Siaka Stevens was away on a visit to Europe, a group attacked with explosives the residence of the then acting Vice President and Prime Minister C.A. Kamara Taylor. Though Kamara Taylor escaped unhurt, the building was severely damaged. The blast echoed across the capital city. It was reported to be an attempted coup against the government. Within a few days, most of the suspects had been detained, and details of the plot began to unfold. The plotters, according to the charges drawn up against them in August 1974, had planned to overthrow the government of Sierra Leone by killing the then acting president, S.I. Koroma, the then acting vice president, Kamara Taylor, and the force commander, Brigadier Joseph Saidu Momo, by attacking their official residences with explosives in the early hours of July 30, 1974. They also planned to seize the magazine at Tower Hill in Freetown. The groups that were detailed to attack S.I. Koroma and Joseph Saidu Momo abandoned their plans on hearing the blast from Kamara Taylor's residence. When Siaka Stevens returned from abroad, he instituted a treason trial. It was reported that Siaka Stevens asked the Attorney General, Luceni Brewer, to charge the detainees with treason. It was reported that Luceni Brewer, as Attorney General, refused to charge the detainees with treason, arguing that an attempt on the lives of one or two members of the government does not by the fact itself constitute an attempt to overthrow that government, and therefore does not qualify as a treasonable offense. It was reported that Siaka Stevens was unhappy, and when shortly thereafter Luceni Brewer left the country to attend the Law of the Sea conference, he appointed N.A.P. Buck as acting Attorney General, who then preferred the charge of treason against the suspects before the return of Luceni Brewer, and Luceni Brewer was transferred to the Ministry of Works. Amongst the 15 charged with treason were Mohamed Sori Forna, Ibrahim Bashtaki, former Army Commander David Lansana, an ex-Army Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara, an ex-Paramount Chief by Makari and Silk, and Unfa Mansare, who was a cook employed by a foreign business concern. A Lance Corporal in the Army, Kane Deka Sesai, who had disappeared from the barracks a few days before the incident, died as a result of severe wounds sustained during the attack on Kamara Taylor's official quarters. To conceal the facts, the plotters allegedly dumped his body into a river in the northern province, from where it was fished out by divers as the investigations continued. As the trial proceeded, it was disclosed that several meetings were held at the home of ex-Army Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara, whom Mohamed Forna described as his business partner. He had joined the army in December 1951. On the orders of the executed former Army Commander John Amadou Bangura, he was detained in October 1970 and was not released until July 1973. While in detention, he was retired from the military in 1972. He was reported to have harbored a deep resentment against the government, and he allegedly got in touch with the cook Unfa Mansare to recruit reliable soldiers for the plot, as Unfa had lived for a considerable while in the vicinity of Wilberforce Barracks in Freetown. At one stage in the trial, reference was made to attempts to secure the support of the leader of the banned UDP, Dr. John Karefa Smart. Other allegations at the trial included the offer of financial inducements to ISU personnel not to challenge the soldiers during the coup attempt. In fact, the 13th accused, Alimami Mansare, was a sub-inspector attached to the ISU, while the 14th accused, Mohamed Touré, was a sergeant in the same force. Mohamed Soria Forna was regarded as the financier of the plot, and he testified in his summary of evidence that he was aware of undercurrents of discontent in the army, but did not go out to exploit the situation. His statement suggested that he was drawn into the unfortunate affair because of his association with ex-Army Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara. Had the coup succeeded, according to the testimony of a prosecution witness, the plotters hoped to establish two councils, one civilian and one military. The former would have included Mohamed Sore Forna, Ibrahim Bashtaki, ex-brigadiers David Lansana and Andrew Jackson Smith, and others. The councils would have eventually handed over power to a new government, after a general election in which the APC, SLPP and the UDP would have taken part. On November 17, 1974, all 15 accused were found guilty and sentenced to death. The reference to military personnel during the trial of Mohamed Sore Forna and 14 others may have convinced the authorities that the role of the army in the abortive coup was significant. Early in January 1975, the court-martial of 9 soldiers began. The accused, charged with inciting soldiers to join the plot to overthrow the government, were Warrant Officer Class 1, Yaya Sadi Kalogo, Sergeant Thomas Davies, Sergeant Edward Kande, Private Mohammed Amara, Lance Corporal von Farmer, Staff Sergeant Bomag Bagbai, Warrant Officers Class 2 Tamba Ansumana and Thomas Kowa, and Staff Sergeant Bernard Kemo. The allegations at the court-martial included a gift of 300 leon to Warrant Officer Class 1 Kalogo, who apparently served as the military ringleader, and a systematic plan to sabotage the force's communication system on the night of the coup attempt. Sergeant Kande was reported to have been in the party that dynamited Kamara Taylor's residence, while Von Farmer's group was detailed to kill acting President S.I. Koroma. Private Amara was to take care of the Sierra Leone external telecommunications and the Sierra Leone broadcasting service. Sergeant Davies alleged that the plotters decided to use explosives because no arms were received from the ISU. On January 17, 1975, Warrant Officer Class 2 Tamba Ansumana was pronounced not guilty by the President of the Court-Martial, Major J.S. Gotor. Of the remaining 8 soldiers, 1 was recommended for mercy while the rest were to face the firing squad. Mohamed Sorie Forna, Ibrahim Bashtaki, David Lansana and the 12 other civilians appealed against the death sentence, but the court freed only one appellant, Issa Jallo, for lack of sufficient evidence. A bid by the 14 to have their case heard in the Supreme Court, the highest court under the Constitution, was rejected. While awaiting execution, the condemned men were given pens and papers to write short notes to families and loved ones. Mohammed Soriaforna was asked to write a letter to Siaka Stevens in order to plead for clemency. However, he refused to beg Siaka Stevens for his life. Instead, he used the pen and paper supplied to him for his mercy plea to compose an account of his life from boyhood to his death, relating his hopes for the country, his experiences in politics, and the guiding principles that caused him to relinquish his position. To the case against him, he devoted no more than a page, pinpointing the lies made against him by some of the witnesses. Ibrahim Bashtaki also wrote a short note to his wife, and the letter was smuggled out of the prisons. In his letter, he maintained his innocence by stating that he still maintained what he said in the witness box, that he was innocent of the crimes for which he will be executed for. When 8 coffins were delivered to the gates of Pademba Road Prison in Freetown, there were several witnesses to their arrival, and the word soon spread around the city. On July 19, 1975, Mohammed Soriaforna, ex-Army Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara, Ibrahim Bashtaki, David Lansana, Bai Makari and Silk, George Thompson, an SLPP stalwart, and 2 soldiers were executed at Pademba Road Prison in Freetown. The executions began at midnight of July 19th. The first 2 men to die were the soldiers. The civilians were executed in the order in which they were indicted by the court. Mohammed Soriaforna was the first accused. Ex-Army Lieutenant Habib Lansana Kamara was the second accused. Ibrahim Bashtaki was the third accused. David Lansana was the 5th accused. George Thompson was the 10th accused, and Bai Makari and Silk was the 12th accused. The death sentences in respect of the remaining 8 civilians and 4 soldiers were commuted to life imprisonment. In the morning hours, the bodies of the 8 men who had been executed were displayed before the crowds outside the Pademba Road Prison in Freetown, in order to send a strong message to all those who might want to attempt to overthrow the government. Under cover of darkness, the bodies were removed, loaded into military trucks, and driven out to the Rokupa Cemetery in the east end of Freetown, where they were doused with acid and dumped in a mass grave. This event became known as the celebrated case of Mohammed Soriaforna and 14 others.